Alright, so for this video, we're going to be talking about Barbarian. And what's weird about Barbarian to me is that Barbarian is actually in a terrible place compared to the other classes in the game, while also having next to nothing changed about Barbarian. And I think that's kind of unfortunate. So let's talk about a couple of the major changes. Barbarian did not receive any nerfs in this last patch. Everything about Barbarian got buffed. So why is Barbarian in such a terrible place right now in terms of how their skills function, how their kit functions, how their gear works? Why am I saying Barbarian is in such a bad position right now? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple, you see. And I don't think I can stress this enough. Barbarian's major problem is that nothing got changed on them. Now, the inherent nerfs to vulnerable and crit that you would say, well, Barbarian's not affected by vulnerable and crit. They still have pressure points where lucky hit for any of your core skills to 10, 20, 30% chance to make enemies vulnerable. This means that they still have reliable source of vulnerable damage. There's also other skills that they have that can make enemies vulnerable. Kick can make enemies vulnerable. Charge can make enemies vulnerable. Steel Grasp can make enemies vulnerable. I don't think Death Blow can, if I remember. Yeah, Death Blow can, right? So they have a number of tech options for vulnerable damage pools. In addition to that, just about any skill of theirs can crit. While using two-handed weapons, you deal increased critical strike damage. So obviously, you can buff that. You can buff into critting. There's also plenty of options that they have for crits and stuns in Paragon, or crits and overpowers, I should say. So as an example, here we go. Damaging enemies with one-handed weapons increases critical strike chance. Right? You have other tricks that you can use where you can get bonus crit in berserking. You have guaranteed overpowers, which applies to just any skill as well, not just bludgeoning skills. So there's a lot of ways that you can cheese out extra crits, extra overpowers, extra vulnerables. So why is this class in such a terrible position damage-wise? Well, there's a myriad of factors. In my opinion right now, Barbarian is right there in B tier. It is maybe a little bit above Necromancer. You could say it's in high B tier and Necromancer's low B tier, or you could have Barb at B and Necro at C. Whatever you want to call it. But if Barb didn't get any changes, why is Barbarian in such a terrible position? Well, one of the major issues that you have is that damage over time builds got nerfed. That includes bleed, because of how the damage stacking works. Now, bleed has always been relatively terrible, but bleed has been able to parry well with Thorns build. So if you want to make a Thorns Barbarian, you run bleed, even though Thorns is your major component to it. The majority of the Barbarian builds are okay at best, or just too specialized. So if you look at the basic builds that are available to you, Whirlwind is still good because it still crits, it still overpowers. The downside is how reliably do you crit. Hoda is still very good because it hits incredibly hard for single target DPS. It's not really good for crowds. It can overpower a decent amount. It can crit a decent amount. It has decent bulk damage, but at the end of the day, it's not the best skill in the world. It's still right up there as being a top tier damage clearing skill, but you have to build into everything on Barbarian now, whereas other classes can lean more one way or another. Blood Necro is still building primarily overpower. Bone Necro is still primarily building crit. Shadow Necro is building damage over time. You know, if Barbarians have to build all three categories to get value in most regards. Upheaval got a fantastic buff that makes it a fantastic skill to use, having more higher end damage now. But Upheaval still has a little bit of a skill requirement in aiming it and the time to swing it, things of that nature. Not a big skill requirement, but still. Double Swing hasn't seen any significant changes, which still means that it's only really good at the stun Fury spam build, where you hit a stunned enemy with Double Swing and you get your Fury cost back. So you can then rinse and repeat and continue stun, Fury, stun, Fury, stun, Fury to get all this massive damage. It's also taking advantage of your one-handed weapons instead of a two-handed weapon, meaning it deals less damage and it's less impactful to you. Then if you look at some of the other niche builds out there, the triple shout build is still super effective because shouts neither got buffed or nerfed, and because none of the barbarian skills really received any changes besides upheaval getting a slight buff. Shout Barbarian is still best. You have a basic skill to generate, you have a core skill to spend it, you have all 3 shouts, and then your choice of a filler perk. Whether you want to run an ultimate, whether you want to run Death Blow for burst damage, whether you want Steel Grasp for either vulnerable or berserking trigger, whether you want Charge for an extra unstoppable. The problem that Barbarian has is the majority of their skills fall into this category of just being mediocre filler options. Like, look at it. You're gonna run a basic skill most of the time for generating or as a fallback. You're gonna run a core skill the majority of the time for damage. Most meme builds completely cut out a core skill. I have a meme build that cuts out a core skill, which I'll cover in a minute. But you're gonna run one of these. Okay, so you have 3 whole categories right here that are supposed to be filler perks, right? Until you get to your ultimate, but really you just have shouts and filler perks. Ground Stomp is a purely offensive skill for the most part that just sets up a stun. It does nothing else besides set up a stun. You can get some fury off of it, or you can get some cooldown reduction off of it, but it does nothing on its own besides stun. That's kind of hard for a barbarian to slot in given the defensive problems that they have. Iron Skin is an abysmally terrible skill that requires a decent amount of knowledge on the skill and a legendary aspect for you to even consider running this skill. It doesn't do a lot for you and is one of the only mediocre healing skills that you get. So the problem that this skill has, it's one of the only options you have for recovery. Now, the shouts do have a modifier where you can heal allies and yourself for 1, 2, or 3% of their maximum life per second, and they do have a decent duration upgrade, which is in front of it. The problem is that you're committing a lot of resources into the shouts. If the developers want you to look away from the shouts, you kind of don't have any reason why you would look away from the shouts. Kick is similar to Ground Stomp, is a mediocre damage option that's best utility is Power Kick, where it spends all of your fury. This is basically the bone spirit of Barbarian. Now, this works well. This is a fun skill to use, and it does have good synergy with both Ground Stomp and Leap for the mediocre brawling build. But the problem with that build is that you're not taking advantage of any of your core skills, and you're relying heavily on Kick to be your primary source of damage dealing and vulnerable applications. Charge is an incredibly terrible skill to be using as a mobility tool. The cooldown is too long for you to effectively use it for movement, so it becomes an escape option whenever you become stunned or crowd control impaired, so you can just use Unstoppable and get out of it. And none of the follow-up skills are any good, besides, hey, you can also use it as a tech option if you want vulnerable damage. So again, if you are not running a core skill, you kind of feel shoehorned into running either Charge or Kick to take advantage of the vulnerable damage pool. And if you're not using the vulnerable damage pool, you would never run Charge unless you want another crowd control, which Rallying Cry does that better, because Rallying Cry gives you crowd control immunity for up to 7.5 seconds. Granted, you have to put points into it here, but at the same time, you're pretty much doing the same thing with Charge. You need to put points into it to get the cooldown down on it. Here, you don't worry about the cooldown. The points that you would put into Charge for the cooldown reduction are instead being put in here for duration. And again, 7.5 seconds of crowd control immunity is one of the longest amounts of duration in the game, but I'll circle back to that in a minute. Leap is once again more of an offensive skill. It doesn't do anything defensively. It doesn't really get you out of trouble. It more is used to start engagements. And there is a decent amount of reset options that you have with it, with the legendary aspects for Stomp and Kick, that make it a very fun brawly build where you're constantly juggling Leap and Kick and Stomp. But the problem at the end of the day is that Leap, similar to Stomp, similar to Charge, doesn't have defensive applications to it. It's primarily an offensive skill. Barbarian lacks any decent defensive skills. Their only defensive skills are the shouts and shitty Iron Skin. Now, here's the other problem. These are all damage skills down here, or used for triggering status conditions, and when you look down here, you're pretty much getting the same thing. Iron Maelstrom is strictly a damage-dealing skill. Call of the Ancients is strictly a damage-dealing skill. And Wrath of the Berserker is strictly a status condition skill that gives you unstoppable and berserking for a little while. So what is the major problem that this build has? It's supposed to be a tanky, brawling class that gets in close. It has no long-range damage applications. You have to use Steel Grass to get enemies in close to you, or you can bring yourself closer to them with Charge or Leap. So it has to get in close. The singular skill that they have that hits the farthest is Upheaval. Upheaval hits the farthest away from you without actually moving an enemy into your range or moving you into their range. Because Lunge is another interesting option. You can lunge into an enemy to take advantage. Here's the problem that I realistically have. Barbarian just plain and simple sucks defensively. They rely so heavily on their legendary aspects. But the majority of your legendary aspects that you're going to run defensively are going to be taken up by offensive slots. One of the easiest to get chess pieces is Rage of Hagaroth. Rage of Hagaroth is primarily a cooldown reduction skill, meaning you're going to be using this primarily in offensive focused builds. Razor Plate is another example of this if you can get Razor Plate. That leads me to a further point. If you look at all of the other classes in the game, now you have reliable ways of grinding Uber Uniques. When you go up and you go fight Duriel and you're trying to grind Uber Uniques, what are you really trying to get out of the Uber Uniques themselves? What are you trying to get? Every class in the game has an advantage. See, the biggest thing that you want is the Grandfather. However, two problems with that. One, if you're running a build that needs you to use a specific two-handed unique, like, let's say you're a Bleed Barbarian and you need Fields of Crimson. I don't have it on this character, but let's say you're running a Berserking Barbarian and you need Ancient's Oath, where you get the extra Steel Grasp bonuses. You can't run a Grandfather in that situation. In addition to that, what if instead of running a various unique, you need to have both of your two-handed slots dedicated to specific aspects? This Barbarian is literally built around this one right here. Meaning, if I were to grab a Grandfather, sure, I'd run it, but now I have to bump Whirlwind Critical Strike, which is best as a two-handed, onto either a one-handed or an Amulet. And that really becomes a problem. The Amulet itself is also primarily used at the defensive slot because Barbarian doesn't get a lot of utility. Most Barbarians tend to take their ring slots and dedicate them to resource regeneration, whether it's Fury generation or cooldown reduction on shouts, and nothing really is being done to improve Barbarian's biggest issue. Barbarian's biggest issue is survivability. So Barbarians are lackluster in terms of what they're hunting in Uber Uniques and better legendaries. Sure, there's things you can go out and get, you're not going to complain, but every other class in the game can go out and hunt a specific unique now, and that will fix the majority of their builds. Whereas on Barbarian kind of has to see if the unique fits the build they're looking to run. You're not building a single Barbarian build around any of the uniques or Uber Uniques in the game. That's part of the problem. Like, if you're running Upheaval, sure, you'll run Hellhammer. If you're running Whirlwind, sure, you'll run Devastating Grips. If you're running Frenzy, sure, you'll run the Amulet for Frenzy. I don't remember what it's called. That's just an example of what I'm talking about. Because you're constantly going to be grabbing these uniques, you're never actually using any of these uniques unless it really fits your build 100% for what you want to do. Not to mention the fact that another issue that Barbarian has in terms of survivability is that they have no reliable source of either healing or damage immunity. Every other class in the game has a complete damage immunity skill. Period. They may only have one option, but you press one button and you become damage immune. Whether it's Blood Mist, whether it's Lacerate, whether it's Deep Freeze, whether it's Flame Shield. I don't play Rogue, fuck Rogue. Here's the thing. Barbarian doesn't get access to anything like that. The most you can do is get either damage reduction, or you can get crowd control immunity. And damage reduction, the best skill you have for damage reduction is Challenging Shout, which becomes a good skill just because of the damage reduction, whereas most Druid players would completely forego Debilitating Roar as the Werebear skill because it's just not necessary. There's better skills out there. Whereas on a Barbarian, Challenging the Shout becomes necessary because it's one of the only skills you have that gives you damage reduction or crowd control. Specifically for crowd control immunity, you have Rallying Cry while it's active, you have Charge if you choose to run it, and you have Wrath of the Berserker for a very limited window of time. It's not the full duration of Wrath of the Berserker. It's only for 5 seconds. And that is tied to a 60-second ultimate cooldown. This is just crowd control. Yes, you can get Iron Skin with a legendary aspect to give you unstoppable for the duration of it, but again, that's requiring a legendary aspect. Whereas if you look at a class like Druid has access to Earth and Bulwark, they have access to the Werebear skill for a short duration, they have access to Lacerate, which is complete damage immunity, not just crowd control immunity. Right away, they have better options. Same thing if you look at Necromancer has one option, which is Blood Mist, but that's healing, that's damage immunity, that's crowd control immunity, right there. Druid also has healing options as well. Debilitating Roar can heal if you run the modifier, and they have Blood Howl, which can heal you as well. They have 2 direct ways they can heal themselves. Sorceress, in a similar vein, has Flame Shield, which is complete damage immunity, crowd control immunity, and a source of healing if you choose to run it. Teleport for damage and crowd control immunity, Deep Freeze for damage and crowd control immunity, plus healing on it with an aspect, Ice Armor with an aspect that can give you crowd control immunity as well. And they even have Blizzard, which can give you damage reduction, which is an offensive skill that's giving you damage reduction. The best thing you can get out of a Barbarian is, oh yeah, if I run Frenzy and I have multiple stacks, I get damage reduction for each stack of Frenzy I have. Yay me. Barbarian's major flaws is that they didn't receive any buffs or changes in this last patch. They don't have any exciting new gear that I want to go hunt for. If I'm going to go hunt for gear, I'm hunting for generic gear, not this will put me over the top of my Barbarian build, except maybe a Grandfather, which again is kind of build specific. They don't have anything in Paragon that's really wowing me and making me go out of my way. So for example, something I mentioned is look at your Paragon nodes that you have access to. Bleeding damage is increased by Vulnerable. Berserk and Bleed, Berserk. Each time you make an enemy vulnerable, your damage is increased, and then you'll get an additional bonus if you overpower that enemy. Guaranteed overpower. This is pretty good. Or every 75 Fury you spend, you gain 15% Fortify. Or, hey wait, swapping weapons grants you a whole whopping 4% of your Fury. Barbarian just doesn't have anything going for it right now that really puts it in a position that's viable. It's kind of playing like the backwards version of either build. It's a faster, slightly bulkier, not tankier by the way, bulkier version of a Sorceress. It plays like close range Sorceress does. Or it plays like a faster, more damage oriented Druid. Now, one thing is, I don't think that the leveling experience on Barbarian is terrible. I actually enjoy leveling Barbarian 1 through 50, where I didn't like that with Druid. That's because Barbarian doesn't require a lot of gear to get going. But once you get to the end game, you're going to find that the gear that you were using is usually better gear besides stat bonuses. Once you get your set of legendary aspects you're looking for, you're not really doing a lot to change it. And that unfortunately makes Barbarian suffer. Barbarian doesn't have top-end damage potential outside of niche builds. And yeah, there's a lot of fun meme builds you can make. I made a brawling build that runs Kick, Charge, Leap, Ground Stomp, Rallying Cry, and a basic skill. I've made a Berserking build that runs Frenzy, no core skill, Rallying Cry, Kick, Death Blow, Steel Grasp, and Berserker. Fun build, even though it doesn't use a core skill, but at the end of the day, that's by design. Walking Arsenal is very complicated to get going. Berserking is not easy to understand by any means. Unbridled Rage really only works on either Upheaval or, and that's a big or Hoda. And Bleed is pretty much shit, but Gushing Wounds is an interesting bleed build that you can sort of side-spec into. Because of that, you're going to find yourself in an awkward position trying to get some of these builds to work properly. Because a lot of these builds don't function how you intend them to function. They're lackluster because they don't build into a specific kind of top-end damage. For example, Sorceress builds are building heavy into crit in every single build, except for Ice, which builds a little bit into vulnerable and crit, right? If you look at a build like Druid, Druids want to build into either crit, overpower, or vulnerable, or some combination. Barbarians don't have to build into crit, have to build into vulnerable, or have to build into overpower, which also means they build into all three, meaning you're split too many different ways. Honestly, the problem that Barbarian has is that every single Barbarian build outside of Bleed is pretty good. The downside is that every single Barbarian build outside of Bleed is pretty good. It holds back what your top-end potential is for what you can do, and it makes the class feel unfun to play once you get to higher end. I've been very much enjoying playing Necro, Sorceress, at high end, testing these new builds I made because there's some relative creativity that I have. If I swap out this for this, I get a definitively better result. I've been doing a lot of tinkering on those builds, saying, hey, maybe I can tweak this and tweak that, get a little bit higher end damage. Not necessarily maybe a unique build, but what I find enjoyable. Whereas playing Barbarian in late game, I really feel like I could swap out any of the skills that I have except for Rallying Cry and be perfectly fine in combat. Nothing would change. And I think that's ultimately why I think Barbarian fell. Nothing happened to Barbarian to make it drop, but that's why it's dropping. It just doesn't have that high-end potential that the other classes simply do.